Hey guys, tonight we step into a part of Greek mythology that rarely gets the spotlight, a quiet throne in a quiet realm, where golden souls drift in silence and time forgets itself. Down beneath the marble columns and stormy cloudscapes of Olympus lies a domain ruled not by lightning, love, or song, but by solemn order. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the Greek underworld, not because it's hellfire and brimstone, but because you'd be so stunned by how organized and unchaotic it actually is. Hades runs a tight ship, a silent, eternal, mildly terrifying ship. So, before you settle into comfort, if stories like this bring you a sense of peace, please consider a gentle tap on the like and subscribe buttons. There's no obligation, of course, but it truly helps our late-night journeys. Find more fellow travelers. Feel free to post your location and local time. It's always amazing to see where and when our sleepy little myths are reaching you. Now, let the outside world fade away. Dim the lights down low. Let the soft white noise of a fan carry you. Take a deep breath and step with me into tonight's story. When the world was young and full of chaos, not metaphorically, but literally, chaos. The great yawning void. The Titans reigned. Kronos, the big boss of that generation, ruled by swallowing his children whole. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy family man, but eventually, one of those kids, Zeus, did what younger siblings do best. He stirred up a rebellion. Alongside his brothers Poseidon and Hades, he overthrew their Titan father and saved the family, or at least the ones still digesting in Kronos' belly. Once the war was won, and let's be real, it was mostly Zeus and his lightning that sealed the deal. The brothers divided up the cosmos, and here's where things get dicey. They didn't have a meeting or file paperwork. Nope, they drew lots. Poseidon got the sea, Zeus got the sky, and Hades, he drew the underworld. Now modern folks might think that's like drawing the short straw, but in Greek thought, it wasn't necessarily a punishment. It was a role, a realm, a necessary place in the balance of all things. Still, let's just say Hades didn't get the best PR team. You'll hear scholars toss around ideas here. Classicists still argue whether Hades chose the underworld out of a natural affinity for quiet power, or whether he was genuinely disappointed and retreated beneath the earth out of resentment. One ancient source, a fragment from the lost Titanomachy poem, suggests Hades volunteered for the role, thinking it would give him freedom from Olympus drama. If so, it definitely worked. Hades ruled the dead, all of them, kings, beggars, heroes, even minor gods, who expired in the countless weird wars of mythology, but it wasn't death itself. That job belonged to Thanatos, the god of peaceful passing, and he wasn't responsible for torment either. That was left to the judges of the dead, and a certain trio of punishment-happy furies. He was more like the landlord, and like many landlords, Hades kept to himself. No parties, no love affairs with mortals, well, maybe one, but we'll get to that. No shape-shifting seductions or divine drama. He sat on his throne of obsidian and watched the souls pass by, ensuring balance was kept. And oh, he had riches, literal rivers of gold, precious stones nestled deep in the earth, and the power to render himself invisible at will. Ever heard of the Helm of Darkness? That was his, and it wasn't just for show. Even the war gods borrowed it. Still, the stories about Hades are few, and almost always misunderstood. He didn't throw tantrums like Zeus, or pick fights like Ares, or meddle like Athena. He was constant, cold, perhaps, but not cruel, even in his earliest depictions. Like those scratched onto 5th century red figure pottery, Hades sits calm and composed, with his scepter in hand and a faraway look in his eyes. Sometimes, there's a faint smile, the kind you'd see on someone who knows more than he's letting on. So why the villain label? Why the centuries of horned helmets and fiery pits? Well, for that, we need to look deeper past the gods, past the mortals, even past the rivers of the underworld, and into one of the most misunderstood love stories of all time. But before we get there, remember, this quiet, distant god wasn't just a shadow on Olympus. He was 1/3 of the ruling triad, the keeper of balance, the elder brother, forgotten by many, feared by most, and respected, though never quite loved by all. Now that we've met Hades, let's clear up a little confusion, a confusion that's been haunting him for millennia. No, he is not, and never was, the devil. In fact, if you were to mention the devil to an ancient Greek, you'd probably get a blank stare and a polite suggestion to stop talking nonsense. The Greeks didn't have a concept of hell like the later Abrahamic traditions did. There was no fire and brimstone villain lurking underground, waiting to tempt or torture. What they had was the underworld, neutral, necessary, eternal, and its calm, steady ruler. Hades didn't hunt souls. He didn't whisper temptations into mortals' ears or set traps for the virtuous. He didn't even welcome the dead with a cackle and a red carpet. He simply received them. Imagine a slightly aloof, impeccably dressed host at an upscale eternal residence, standing at the top of a long staircase. That's Hades. You arrive. He gives you a nod. You go where you're assigned. He watches to make sure no one escapes or causes trouble. Now, despite what every cartoon and action-adventure movie has told you, Hades didn't invent torture. The torments of the underworld, the rock-rolling of Sisyphus, the hunger of Tantalus, the eternal spinning wheel of Ixion were assigned by 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Iolcus. Hades may have watched it all happen, but the decisions were made by others. He was, if anything, the administrator. Classicists still argue about the emotional tone of Hades in myth. Was he dispassionate because he was immortal and above it all? Or did he take on the role of a cosmic functionary, burying any feelings deep beneath the sticks? Some surviving scholia, marginal notes written by ancient scribes, suggest that Hades was called Eubulis, meaning good counselor, in part because he rarely let emotion cloud his judgment. That's a far cry from pitchforks and flame. Here's another fun twist. Hades had several nicknames in ancient Greek religion, and most of them were euphemisms. People didn't like saying his name directly. That's not because he was evil. It was out of respect and, okay, maybe just a little fear. Kind of like how people whisper Voldemort in certain wizarding circles. He was called meaning the wealthy one, because all things buried in the earth belonged to him. Gold, silver, crops, seeds, even ancestors. If it went below ground, it was his domain. This version of Hades, the generous wealth giver, was sometimes honored in secret rites, especially during planting and harvest seasons. But still, temples, shrines, festivals, almost non-existent. While Zeus had entire mountaintop sanctuaries and Athena had the Parthenon, Hades got a few quiet groves and maybe a cave or two. His most notable temple was in Elis, and it only opened once a year. That's about the equivalent of giving someone a birthday party and then ghosting them for the next 364 days. Maybe people feared inviting him too close. There's a debate among scholars, especially those looking at Orphic texts and Pythagorean philosophy, about whether Hades' isolation was by design. Did he want to be left alone? Was his domain meant to reflect the quiet dignity of death itself? Or did mortals project their fears onto him until the silence felt sinister? Whatever the case, he didn't mind. Hades wasn't here for adoration. He wasn't a politician like Zeus, or a performer like Apollo. He didn't throw thunderbolts, or orchestrate poetry contests. He just kept the balance, quietly, invisibly, unfailingly. One lesser-known myth found in the writings of the poet, Claudian paints Hades as the only Olympian who refused to attend a particularly chaotic wedding party on Olympus. His absence was seen not as rudeness, but as wisdom. When the wine gods dance and the war gods flirt, sometimes staying home in your cold stone palace with your dog is the healthiest choice. And speaking of dogs, we're about to meet one with more heads than manners. But first, one last note. Hades' realm wasn't evil. It was structured. It had gates and rivers, meadows and dungeons, judges and ferrymen. Think of it less like a fiery punishment zone, and more like a cosmic DMV run by an eternal accountant. A very powerful, mildly intimidating accountant in a robe. So the next time someone tries to tell you Hades is the Greek devil, feel free to gently remind them, he's just the landlord. Let's talk real estate, specifically, Hades' not-so-horrific domain. Because for all the drama surrounding the Greek underworld, it wasn't what you think. No flames, no sulfur, and surprisingly, no eternal screaming. At least, not in most neighborhoods. The Greek underworld was vast. Think less pit of torment and more eternal suburbs, with very strict zoning laws. It was divided into several distinct areas, some gloomy, some downright pleasant, and some you definitely didn't want to end up in. And Hades, he presided over all of them with the poise of a mildly bored CEO who's read the same end-of-life paperwork for thousands of years. So, what were these neighborhoods? First, there was the Asphodel Meadows, a sort of cosmic waiting room for average souls. Not great, not terrible. If you lived a perfectly uneventful life, didn't offend any gods, didn't die a hero, and didn't do anything truly vile, this is where you landed. Souls here just existed. Think of it like that one dream you have, where you're standing in a field, and everything is fine, but a little fuzzy. Eternity in sepia tone. Then there was Elysium, also known as the Elysium Fields, the VIP lounge of the dead, reserved for heroes, demigods, and those specially favored by the gods. You could almost hear soft music playing here. The air was warmer, and there were plenty of philosophical debates under leafy trees. If you were especially exceptional, you might even get reincarnated, earn your spot again, and then be promoted to the Isles of the Blessed, where you'd get an upgrade, with ocean views and no more rebirth cycles. Basically, heaven's heaven. On the other end of the spectrum, Tartarus. This was the place people picture when they think hell. But even here, it wasn't ruled by Hades. Tartarus was older than he was. It was more like an ancient sealed-off dungeon at the bottom of the cosmic basement. Kronos was locked up there, so were the 100-handed giants, and the very, very unlucky souls who committed crimes against the divine order. We're talking cosmic, tax evasion level offenses. And between these realms flowed 5 rivers, each with a personality, all its own. There was the Styx, river of oaths, cross it at your peril, because even gods couldn't break a promise sworn upon it. Then the Lethe river of forgetfulness, souls dipped in it to erase memory before reincarnation. Acheron, the river of sorrow, where most entered the underworld. Phlegethon, the river of fire. Okay, so there was a little flame, but it was more of a dramatic lighting effect than a torture chamber. And finally, quietest, the river of wailing, which will pay for, does what it says on the jar. The soul transport system was equally refined. You needed to pay Koran, the ferryman, with a coin placed in your mouth at burial. No coin, you got stuck on the shore, haunting the banks like someone who forgot their bus fare. It was Hades' policy, no exceptions. Honestly, he ran a tighter afterlife than most airlines, and if you tried to sneak in or out, that's where Cerberus came in. The massive 3-headed dog with a tail like a serpent and a bark like a minor earthquake. He wasn't there to attack visitors, just to keep them in. A good boy with a very strict job. Classicists still argue whether the Greeks saw these underworld divisions as literal geography or symbolic frameworks for the human soul. Some texts, like Plato's myth of suggest a kind of metaphysical map, a moral cartography of the afterlife. Others argue that the divisions reflected stages of understanding, levels of spiritual refinement, or even social stratification projected into eternity. But here's the key takeaway. The underworld wasn't evil. It was a mirror of the world above, structured around justice, memory, consequence, and renewal. Souls weren't damned in the Christian sense. They were processed, sorted, and sometimes given second chances. Even Hades' palace was more administrative than ominous. Ancient poets describe its black marble halls, glimmering with precious stones. Statues of former kings, draped in the dust of centuries, lined its corridors. The throne of Hades itself, polished obsidian, set between pillars carved from bone and crystal. Intimidating, yes, but horrifying. Not necessarily. Just ... timeless ... And here's a lesser-known tidbit from the Homeric hymns. It was said that Hades' halls echoed with the sound of rushing rivers and wind. No screams, no fire, just the whisper of eternal flow. Still, over time, the line between Hades the place and Hades the god began to blur. Later, Romans would conflate him with their god Pluto and mix in darker imagery. Christian reinterpretations layered on new fears, and eventually, pop culture solidified the mistake. Ruler of the underworld equals king of evil. It was a branding nightmare, centuries in the making. But tonight, now that you know better, you can picture the truth. Not a flaming pit, but a cold, dignified city beneath the earth, where souls moved like leaves on the wind, where judgment was calm and fate unhurried, and at its center, Hades silent, watchful, perfectly content to let mortals misjudge him, while he kept the great machinery of eternity running. Ah, yes, that story. If Hades has a PR problem, this myth is the reason. It's the tale you've probably heard in high school or in a very dramatic animated musical. Dark god swoops up innocent spring goddess, drags her to the underworld, and traps her there. But like most ancient myths, the truth is slipperier than a greased eel in a symposium. Let's break it down gently, because what sounds like a straight-up kidnapping might, under ancient eyes, look more like a divine negotiation with questionable optics. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, seasons, and fiercely overprotective parenting, was picking flowers in a meadow, a narcissus, specifically. Suddenly, the ground opened. Out rode Hades in his black chariot, drawn by immortal horses. He snatched her and vanished into the earth. Classic elopement, or classic abduction. On the surface, it seems like a case of Olympian overreach, but here's where it gets complicated. Several ancient sources, including the Homeric hymn to Demeter, mention that Zeus himself approved the match. That's right, Big Brother Zeus greenlit the whole thing. If it was a crime, the king of gods was the getaway driver. Demeter, of course, was not thrilled. She wandered the earth for months, refusing to let crops grow until her daughter was returned. Mortals starved, temples were neglected, and the gods began to panic. You know it's bad when Zeus caves to emotional pressure. Eventually, a compromise was reached. But before Persephone could leave, Hades offered her a parting snack, 6 pomegranate seeds. Now, depending on the version, she either ate them innocently, was tricked, or knowingly accepted the fruit as a symbol of commitment. Because in the rules of the underworld, eating its food binds you to it. It's like checking into a hotel where the mints on the pillow are legally binding. So Persephone was allowed to return, but only for part of the year. The result? 6 months with her mother above ground, 6 months ruling beside Hades below. And this, according to myth, is how we got the seasons. When Persephone rises, Demeter rejoices, spring and summer bloom. When she descends again, Demeter grieves, autumn fades into winter. It's less happily ever after, and more shared custody across cosmic realms. Classicists still argue, did Persephone truly fall in love with Hades? Was she tricked into staying, or did she make a calculated move to ascend from flower-picking maiden to queen of the dead? Some Orphic traditions, the more mystical branches of Greek religion, paint her as more powerful than Hades himself, a guide of souls and holder of secret knowledge. In these versions, she's not a passive victim. She's a critical underworld's first lady, in every sense. And there's a lesser-known version, hinted at in Scholia, on Theocritus, where Persephone laughs as she descends, suggesting not fear but willingness, perhaps even excitement. Interpret that as, you will. It's also worth noting that the marriage wasn't a romantic tragedy in every context. In many parts of ancient Greece, young brides were compared to Persephone, leaving their mothers and joining the mysterious world of adulthood and marriage. The descent to Hades was a metaphor, a symbolic death and rebirth. Unnerving, yes, but not necessarily villainous. Still, Hades didn't exactly win points for style. He showed up in a chariot, said nothing, and disappeared into the earth, ghosting, in the most literal form. Maybe he was shy. Maybe he thought being dramatic would impress her. Maybe he didn't know how to date in a world where gods turned into swans and bulls to flirt. Who's to say? But what's certain is that Persephone changed him. Hades, who had once ruled alone in silent stone halls, now had a partner. Myths tell us he became less stern, that the underworld became warmer, not physically, but emotionally. A place with not just order, but rhythm, a cycle. And as for Persephone, she ruled with a quiet power. Mortals prayed to her for safe passage. In death, her name was whispered in rites and mysteries far older than the Olympians. She wasn't the princess who needed saving. She was the threshold, the one who knew both sides. So was it a kidnapping? Or was it a story about transformation, about death and rebirth, change and return, the aching balance between letting go and coming home? You decide. But either way, don't forget, Hades may have taken her, but he never stopped waiting for her return. We've tiptoed past rivers, rolled pomegranates around in our minds, and now it's time to meet the most loyal, and perhaps misunderstood, employee in the entire Greek underworld, Cerberus. The massive, 3-headed dog with a resume that includes preventing mass escape from death and casual intimidation of heroes. Now, pop culture tends to exaggerate Cerberus. You'll see him foaming at the mouth, surrounded by fire, roaring across stormy stone bridges. But in Greek myth, he's more of a firm but fair bouncer. He's not here to attack the dead. He's here to keep them in. Hades didn't want his realm turning into a ghostly Cerberus was the solution. And let's be clear, he's not evil, he's just doing his job. Descriptions of Cerberus vary across sources, which has led to what classicists gently call mythic inconsistency and what regular people would call total chaos. Most agree he had 3 heads, each able to operate independently. Some later sources like Hyginus and the Roman poets claim 50 or even 100 heads, which, frankly, seems like overkill for a job that mostly involves standing by a gate and growling occasionally. He also had a serpent for a tail, and in some versions, snakes sprouting from his back like bristling fur. Honestly, if Greek artists had access to CGI, Cerberus would have been everywhere. His family tree, a true monster mash. He was the son of Echidna, the half-woman, half-snake mother of monsters, and Typhon, a 100-headed fire-breathing storm giant. Among his siblings, the Hydra, the Chimera, the Sphinx, and, oh yeah, the Nemean lion. Basically, Cerberus came from the mythological version of a very competitive boarding school, but despite his monstrous lineage, he was deeply loyal, not to chaos, not to carnage, to Hades. He stood at the gates of the underworld and made sure no soul wandered out, and no mortal wandered in, without a really good reason. Which brings us to his occasional guests, the heroes. There's Orpheus, the heartbroken musician who lulled Cerberus to sleep with music as he descended to retrieve Eurydice. No bloodshed, just a lyre and a lullaby. Imagine a beast of nightmare, slowly laying down, all 3 heads resting on their massive paws as the music swirls around them like a warm mist. Then came Heracles, or Hercules, if you're feeling Latin, who didn't come with a song. As part of his 12th labor, he was tasked with bringing Cerberus up to the surface, alive, without weapons, so he wrestled him. According to Apollodorus, Heracles grappled Cerberus into submission using sheer strength and lion skin as makeshift armor. Hades, interestingly, allowed it, on the condition that Heracles returned the dog unharmed, and he did, because even Heracles knew, you don't mess with the boss's dog. And let's not forget Aeneas, the Trojan hero turned founder of Rome, who snuck past Cerberus with a drugged honey cake, the world's oldest dog treat. Apparently, the cake appears in Roman sources and may reflect earlier cult rituals where offerings were made to the spirits of the dead, including their ghostly pets. Classicists still argue whether Cerberus had symbolic meaning beyond being an undead watchdog. Some interpret his 3 heads as past, present, and future, a kind of temporal guardian of the soul's journey. Others see him as the line between mortality and eternity. He wasn't violent unless provoked. He wasn't bloodthirsty. He was simply the boundary dot, and boundaries matter in myth. Without them, the dead would flood the living world. The underworld would unravel. Hades knew this. That's why Cerberus mattered. There's a lesser-known tidbit in a scholion on Euripides, Heracles, that claims Cerberus would only bark when someone tried to leave. Anyone entering the underworld passed unnoticed. It's a small detail, but an eerie one. Death is easy to enter. It's the leaving that's tricky, and Cerberus didn't guard alone. Some depictions show him chained, not as punishment, but as protocol. The chain wasn't to restrain him. It was to remind everyone else not to get ideas, because even the best boy needs backup when guarding eternity. So, the next time you imagine Hades as a lonely god in a cold realm, remember, he had a companion, one who never left, one who never judged, just a giant, serpentine-tailed occasionally, sleepy dog, faithfully keeping watch. In a mythology full of betrayal, vanity, and chaos, Cerberus might just be the most reliable character in the pantheon. Let's take a moment to compare siblings. Imagine you're at a family reunion, and on one side you've got Zeus, loud, dramatic, shirt always mysteriously open, hitting on distant cousins, hurling thunderbolts over who brought the wrong dip. Then, in the corner, sipping black ambrosia in complete silence, sits Hades. Brooding, fully clothed. Yes, Zeus may have been the king of the gods, but Hades, he was the adult in the room. From the very beginning, their roles diverged. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. But what came with that underworld was a degree of distance, not just physically, but emotionally. While Zeus gallivanted around starting wars, seducing mortals, and throwing epic tantrums, Hades stayed below, quietly running the eternal afterlife. And here's the fascinating part. Hades wielded just as much power as Zeus, but almost never used it. Take mortal interference. For example, Zeus was constantly in human affairs. He'd shapeshift, send omens, demand sacrifices, and start entire epics. Hades, he rarely left his realm. In most myths, he emerges to the surface once, to abduct Persephone. That's it. One surface trip in several thousand years. Classicists still argue whether this was due to his personal code, or simply an internal rule that the god of the dead should not meddle in the world of the living. Either way, the contrast is sharp. Zeus ruled with spectacle. Hades ruled with structure. Even in conflict, Hades showed restraint. During the epic battle between the Olympians and the giants, Zeus was blasting everyone in sight. Poseidon was throwing entire islands like frisbees. And Hades, he simply used his helmet of invisibility to move silently among the chaos, striking when necessary, unseen and unfazed. According to Pseudo-Apollodorus, his role wasn't flashy, but it was critical. The gods needed him to restore balance. And, speaking of that helmet, the helm of darkness, or kuni, it was so powerful that even gods borrowed it. Athena wore it in the Trojan War. Hermes used it for stealth missions. Perseus took it to sneak past Medusa. Hades never hoarded it. He loaned it out like a generous, if slightly aloof, librarian. Try picturing Zeus sharing his thunderbolt. Go on, we'll wait. There's a lesser-known myth from the Orphic tradition that describes Hades as the only god who keeps his oaths. While Zeus was known for breaking promises, disguising himself, and rewriting the rules mid-game, Hades operated by ancient law. Once a soul entered his realm, he honored their path. Heroes who requested audience, he heard them out. Judges gave verdicts, he upheld them. Mortals asked to return to the world above. If the terms were fair, he allowed it, but never bent the rules. One of the best examples, the tale of Sisyphus. This clever mortal tricked Thanatos, escaped death twice, and mocked the gods. When Zeus caught wind of it, he was furious. A classic thunderbolt situation. But it was Hades who dealt the final punishment. Not fire, not torment, but endless repetition. Roll the stone, watch it fall. Repeat, forever. A punishment elegant in its simplicity, and utterly free of Zeus's usual theatrics. You see, Hades wasn't without judgment, he just wasn't impulsive. And while Zeus ruled with force and spectacle, Hades ruled with permanence. The difference even shows up in ancient worship. Zeus was celebrated with grand festivals, games, and feasts. Hades was honored quietly, in somber rituals, often at night or underground. No cheering crowds, no golden temples, just a whispered prayer, a small coin, a poured libation of dark wine. Even in art, the contrast is striking. Zeus is shown wide-eyed, arms raised, lightning crackling. Hades sits, often with a gentle expression, a scepter in one hand, and the other resting near Persephone or Cerberus. Not passive, not weak, just composed. Some scholars have argued that Hades represents a kind of divine introvert, a necessary counterbalance to Olympus' noisy extroverts. He doesn't need worship, he doesn't seek praise, his power lies in inevitability. After all, everyone eventually meets Hades, not everyone meets Zeus. And here's a quirky detail from a scholian on his head. It suggests that Hades had the cleanest record among the Olympians. No lying, no cheating, no affairs. While Zeus fathered half the Greek pantheon through questionable means, Hades had one partner, and he kept her eternally. So yes, Zeus may have the sky, but the ground beneath your feet, the laws of death, the cycle of life, the silence that follows a hero's final breath. That's all Hades. He didn't need to shout to be feared. He didn't need to conquer to be king. He simply was immovable, unchanging, unflinching, and sometimes that's more powerful than any thunderbolt. Hades wasn't just the god of the dead, he was the god of wealth, too. And no, that's not some ironic twist or cheeky posthumous promotion. It's baked right into his name. One of his epithets was Plautin, which later morphed into the Roman Pluto, and it literally means the wealthy one, which, if you think about it, makes perfect sense. Everything valuable eventually ends up beneath the earth. Gold, silver, precious gems, fertile soil, the seeds that grow into food, and of course, the dead themselves. All of it was considered part of Hades' domain. He didn't just guard the afterlife. He governed the mineral veins, running like golden arteries beneath the surface. Every time someone struck a rich vein of ore or uncovered a trove of buried treasure, it was attributed to his quiet generosity. In fact, ancient farmers often offered the first fruits of harvest, not to Zeus, but to Hades. Why? Because it was Hades who allowed the crops to grow by holding the seeds safely underground during the winter. When they sprouted, it wasn't just Demeter's blessing, it was Hades' permission. Classicists still debate how much this god of wealth aspect of Hades influenced the Eleusinian mysteries, a secretive set of religious rites that promised initiates a better afterlife. These rituals centered on Persephone's return from the underworld and the fertility of the land. But hidden beneath the grain and goddess worship was the quiet acknowledgement that Hades made the cycle possible. No descent, no return, no death, no rebirth. There's a lesser-known account from the Orphic hymns where Hades is praised, not for ruling the dead, but for bestowing abundance. In one hymn, he's called giver of goods and nurturer of mankind, a side of him that almost never appears in the popular imagination, which is frankly rude, considering how many humans have made fortunes mining his domain. And speaking of mining, the ancient Greeks believed that those who unearthed gems or struck valuable minerals were literally touching the god's wealth. It wasn't luck, it was divine favor. Even tombs, ornate or humble, were seen as offerings to the earth, and by extension, to Hades, each one a down payment for a peaceful eternity. That said, Hades didn't flaunt his riches. He didn't build golden thrones or parade around in shimmering robes. His wealth was quiet, enduring, and deeply tied to responsibility. To possess the treasures of the earth was to care for them, to guard them, as he did the souls of the dead. And while Zeus demanded tribute and Poseidon roared for offerings, Hades required something different: respect. Silent offerings, dark-colored, animals for sacrifice, usually black sheep, libations poured directly into the ground, all done with eyes averted. You didn't look Hades in the face, not out of fear, but reverence. He didn't need your praise to validate his power. He knew that all wealth, all life, all things of value eventually returned to him. There's an odd but telling myth, barely a whisper in the texts, where a mortal is granted a single glimpse of Hades' treasure halls. No gold coins or piles of jewels, just endless vaults of names, the names of everyone who had ever died, etched on obsidian slabs, glowing faintly like starlight in the dark. Each name a treasure, each life a deposit, the riches of memory, of legacy. That's the kind of wealth Hades understood. And in a world where gods constantly fought over power, worship, and territory, Hades was content to rule the most permanent resource of all, the inevitable return of all things. So the next time someone tells you Hades was just the creepy god lurking in the shadows, remind them he was also the wealthiest, not because he stole, but because he waited, because he held the roots of every mountain, the seeds of every harvest, and the memories of every soul. And unlike Zeus, he never went bankrupt on dignity. Let's talk accessories. The gods had plenty of them. Poseidon had his trident, Zeus had his lightning bolt, and Athena had her gleaming shield. But Hades, he had something subtler, more mysterious, and arguably much cooler. The helmet of invisibility, also known as the helm of darkness, or kune in Greek. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a piece of divine tech, so powerful, so respected, that even the flashiest gods whispered about it. Worn by Hades during the Titan Machi, that's the great cosmic war against Kronos and the Titans, the helmet allowed him to vanish completely, moving unseen across the battlefield, striking with the quiet precision of inevitability. And while Zeus was zapping and Poseidon was quaking the earth, Hades, ever the introvert, was slipping past enemy lines, sowing confusion, and vanishing before anyone could react. He didn't roar, he didn't grandstand, he let the shadows do the work. But here's what's fascinating. Hades rarely kept the helmet to himself. Throughout Greek myth, the helm of darkness is lent out like some sort of divine library card, one that could instantly turn you into a ghost in plain sight. Perseus borrowed it when he went to decapitate Medusa, sneaking up on a snake-haired Gorgon with a gaze that turns people to stone. Yeah, invisibility helps. Hermes used it on stealth missions, gliding between realms without being noticed. Particularly handy when delivering divine messages or gently escorting wayward souls who'd outstayed their welcome. And even Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, donned the helm during the Trojan War. In Homer's Iliad, She uses it to shield herself from other gods' eyes as she aids Greek warriors. Not a bad endorsement when even the goddess of tactics thinks your headgear is OP. You're doing something right. Classicists still argue whether the helmet was symbolic, a metaphor for the hidden nature of death, or a literal divine object passed among gods like an ancient Greek invisibility cloak. Plato hints in the Republic at the philosophical implications of such a device. If a man could act without being seen or held accountable, would he still be just? The ring of Gyges' story, often confused with the helmet, plays on this very theme. But Hades, he used his invisibility to preserve balance, not disrupt it. And here's a lesser-known nugget. According to Scholia on Pindar, Hades' helmet wasn't forged by the gods, but by the Cyclopes, the same ancient smiths who created Zeus's thunderbolt and Poseidon's trident. 3 legendary weapons, 3 divine brothers, 3 tools of power, gifted before the Titan. It's like a mythological starter pack, but unlike his brothers, Hades' gift wasn't about destruction, it was about absence. The ability to disappear, to observe without being seen, to act without leaving a trace. Invisibility as authority, as control. And it wasn't just physical invisibility. In many ways, the helmet symbolized Hades himself, a presence felt but not seen, a force unacknowledged until you crossed a boundary and realized you'd never come back. His was the realm people pretended not to think about, right up until the moment it claimed them. The helm just made that metaphor literal. Even in artwork from Attic vases to later Roman frescoes, the helmet isn't always shown. Sometimes Hades is depicted without it, his power assumed rather than illustrated. Other times, it's hinted at, a shadow on his brow, a glint of darkness hovering just above his head. One late source, a Roman-era magical papyrus, claims that anyone who forged a helmet in Hades' name and uttered his secret epithet, Ubelus, the good counselor, could become invisible to spirits. Probably not OSHA approved, but it tells you how deeply the myth had rooted itself in mystical thought. And perhaps that's why the Helm of Darkness remains so iconic. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't destructive, it was subtle, strategic, and entirely in line with Hades' personality. He didn't need to be seen to be powerful. He didn't need to be loud to be heard. He simply needed to be there, invisible, inevitable, watching the line between life and death, and making sure no one slipped through uninvited. Now, most people in ancient Greece were content to stay on the mortal side of the veil, the underworld. That was somewhere you went once, and only once. But every so often, a brave or foolish soul decided to drop in early. And unlike your neighborhood DMV, the gates of Hades weren't exactly built for casual visits. Still, Greek mythology is full of bold mortals, and a few gods who dared to cross into the realm of the dead. Not to die, but to negotiate, to rescue, to spy, or in some cases just to prove a point. And Hades, well, he had mixed feelings about it. First, let's be clear, there was no official guest policy. Visitors weren't expected, they weren't encouraged, and they definitely weren't offered refreshments. But if you made it all the way down through the rivers, past Cerberus, into the dimly lit halls of judgment, Hades would receive you, politely, coldly, like a government official who doesn't want to say yes, but can't find a rule that lets him say no. Take Orpheus, the tragic poet whose voice could move trees, rivers, and even gods. After losing his wife, Eurydice, to a snakebite, Orpheus descended into the underworld, playing his lyre the whole way. The music was so beautiful that even the judges of the dead wept. Persephone, often portrayed as the softer influence, was deeply moved, but it was Hades who made the call. He allowed Eurydice to return with one condition. Orpheus must not look back until they'd both reached the upper world. You know how that ended. One glance, one moment of doubt, and she vanished, this time for good. Then there's Heracles again. His labors took him everywhere, including down into the very depths of the underworld to fetch Cerberus. Hades didn't greet him with fire or fury. He just had one rule: you can take the dog, but don't hurt him. Heracles agreed, wrangled Cerberus without weapons, and returned him later, slightly drool-covered, but unharmed. It was weirdly a moment of mutual respect. Even Odysseus made the trip. In Homer's Odyssey, the wily king sails to the edge of the world, performs ancient rites, and summons the spirits of the dead. Technically, he doesn't go all the way in. It's more like standing in the doorway and peeking through. But he speaks with prophets, warriors, even his mother. And while Hades doesn't appear directly, the entire scene takes place under his jurisdiction, the boundary held, no trespassing. But he allowed the window. And then there's the story of Theseus and Pirithous, who thought it'd be a great idea to sneak into the underworld and kidnap Persephone to marry her off. Seriously, Hades was not amused. He welcomed them warmly, seated them at a feast, then trapped them in magical chairs that fused with their flesh. Theseus was later rescued with great difficulty by Heracles. He's still sitting there, stuck for eternity, probably regretting everything. Classicists still debate how much autonomy Hades had in these decisions. Were these visitors fated to succeed? Was he just playing his role in the grand script of myth? Or did he genuinely weigh each case, like a stern but reasonable manager, deciding who gets a hall pass? There's a curious line in the Homeric hymn to Demeter that paints Hades not as cruel, but as a king bound by law. He doesn't act impulsively. When he makes a deal, like with Persephone or Orpheus, or even Theseus, he follows through. But the laws are the laws. Break them, and he will not save you from the consequences. And here's a quirky detail from a lesser-known Orphic fragment. Visitors to the underworld were said to pass through a gate of bronze, inscribed with the words, "No oath spoken here will ever be forgotten." In other words, you might be allowed in, but your actions would be recorded forever. Enter at your own risk, and make no promises you can't keep. You see, Hades wasn't irrational. He wasn't wrathful. He wasn't even particularly surprised when mortals knocked on his door, but he was consistent. He was fair. And once you crossed that threshold, you played by his rules, no matter how heroic, poetic, or absurd your reason for visiting might have been. So the next time you consider storming the gates of the underworld, ask yourself, do you have a lyre that can charm the dead? Can you wrestle a three-headed dog without weapons? Have you your promises? Because if not, Hades will still greet you, but the door back might not open again. Let's shift focus from the occasional guest to the more permanent residents of the underworld. Specifically, the ones whose afterlives were not so much restful as relentlessly repetitive. And when you think of eternal punishment, one name rolls uphill and right back down more than any other: Sisyphus. Now, most people think of Sisyphus as the guy doomed to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. What fewer people know is that the myth doesn't actually blame Hades for that punishment. He just enforces it. He's not the angry school principal handing out detentions. He's the registrar, making sure every punishment is properly assigned, and that nobody cheats their sentence. But let's rewind. Sisyphus was a king of Corinth, clever, cunning, and a bit of a mouth. He was the kind of guy who, if alive today, would have a side hustle in pyramid schemes and a podcast called Life Hacks from the Grave. He ticked off pretty much every god in the sky. He cheated death twice. In one version of the myth, Sisyphus tricks Thanatos, the personification of death, into shackling himself instead. This, understandably, causes a backup in the death department. Nobody dies. People get stabbed, trampled, eaten, and just keep walking around, mildly annoyed. Eventually, Ares, the god of war, gets irritated that his battlefield has turned into a bloodless LARP. He frees Thanatos, who promptly puts Sisyphus back on the divine to-do list. But Sisyphus isn't done. He convinces his wife not to perform the proper funeral rites, then uses that oversight to appeal to Persephone. "Let me go back," he says. "Just for a few days, I'll scold my wife real quick." Persephone, perhaps touched by his devotion, or simply following protocol, agrees. Sisyphus returns to the living world, and refuses to leave. The man basically staged the first afterlife jailbreak. Eventually, the gods lose patience. Zeus might have thundered, but it's Hades who ends up with the long-term paperwork. Sisyphus is dragged back, kicking and screaming, and assigned a very special task: roll a massive boulder up a hill, only to have it slip and fall just before reaching the top, forever. Why this punishment? Scholars still debate. Some think it's symbolic of vain ambition, that Sisyphus's endless task reflects humankind's tendency to chase the unachievable. Others say it's poetic justice. You outwitted death, now death will outwit you, again and again. But here's the thing, Hades didn't choose the punishment. That was likely the decision of the three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Iolcus, who ruled over the souls of the dead. Their job was to weigh your life and assign your eternity. Hades simply provided the realm and enforced the judgment. You might say he was the warden, not the judge or jury. There's even a quirky line in the Scholia on Pindor, suggesting Hades didn't particularly enjoy seeing mortals tormented. His job wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. And once a punishment was assigned, it wasn't undone. Other famous figures joined Sisyphus in Tartarus, Tantalus, doomed to thirst and hunger in front of unreachable fruit and water, Ixion, spinning forever on a flaming wheel for trying to seduce Hera, and the Danaids endlessly filling leaky jars. Hades watched over all of them, not gleefully, just diligently. It's a chilling kind of justice, not personal, not wrathful, just eternal. Some philosophers, especially the later Stoics, saw these punishments as metaphors for life's absurdity. Even Camus, the 20th century French thinker, wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. After all, if existence is a grind, perhaps acceptance is its own rebellion. But in the realm of Hades, there was no need for metaphor. The rock was real, the hill was endless, and Sisyphus would push forever, not because Hades hated him, but because someone had to maintain the order. And Hades, he was that someone, in a world where even the gods were prone to chaos, affairs, and extremely unhinged behavior. Hades was the one figure who followed through. His job wasn't to avenge or scold, it was to hold the line, make sure nothing slipped out, make sure no soul escaped its sentence, make sure the system, however flawed or brutal, kept ticking, because if not him, then who? So the next time you see a boulder and a hill, remember, it's not about cruelty, it's about order, cold, consistent, uncomfortable order, and behind it all stands Hades, silent, watchful, and entirely unimpressed by your escape plan. There are few stories in Greek mythology more achingly bittersweet than the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. It's one of love, music, tragedy, and rules, and at the center of it all, once again, is Hades. You already know the broad strokes. Orpheus, the world's most gifted musician, loses his wife Eurydice to a snakebite on their wedding day. Devastated, he doesn't mourn quietly. He does what no mortal had done before. He descends into the underworld alive, armed only with his lyre and the heartbreaking songs of grief. Now, this wasn't some reckless stunt. Orpheus knew what he was doing. He performed ancient rites, made offerings, called to the spirits, and when he arrived at the gates of Hades, even Cerberus lay down to listen. That's the power of Orpheus's music. It soothed monsters, moved stones, and quieted the ever-flowing rivers of the underworld. And then came the audience, Hades and Persephone, sitting side by side on their shadowy thrones, listened as Orpheus poured out his soul. His song was about love cut short, about dreams undone, about the cruelty of time. And for once, in a place ruled by unchanging laws, something changed. Hades wept. Now, not all sources agree on that detail. Some say it was Persephone who swayed her husband. Others suggest that Orpheus's song didn't make Hades emotional, but rather respectful. After all, Hades valued loyalty. And what was Orpheus's journey, if not the ultimate act of devotion? Whatever the cause, Hades did the unthinkable. He agreed to let Eurydice return. But of course there was a catch. Orpheus could lead her out, but he could not look back until both of them were fully in the world above. If he did, she'd vanish forever. You can guess what happened. The journey back was long, winding, and utterly silent. Eurydice's footsteps were light, ghostly, inaudible. Orpheus, full of doubt and dread, reached the final threshold, stepped into the sunlight, and turned to make sure she was there. She WASN single quotes T. In that very moment, just before she crossed the final line, Eurydice faded back into shadow. No second chances, no renegotiation. Hades had bent the law once. He would not do so again. Classicists still argue about the deeper meaning. Was Hades being cruel? Or was he simply enforcing the one condition of a generous offer? Some believe the myth is a warning about doubt, about patience, about the fragile line between hope and ruin. Others interpret it as a metaphor for grief itself. The idea that no matter how hard you try, you can't bring someone back from the dead. A lesser-known variation from the poet Virgil claims that Orpheus sensed her presence the whole time, but the silence was too much. He didn't look out of mistrust, he looked out of unbearable longing. And still, the rules held. And here's a subtle but telling detail from a Scholian on Ovid's Metamorphoses. Hades didn't punish Orpheus. He didn't trap him, torment him, or strike him down. he simply let him go. Alone, there's power in that restraint, because Hades didn't operate out of malice. He didn't create cruel traps or twist the knife. He offered the one thing no other god could, a second chance. And when that chance was broken, he let the consequences speak for themselves. What makes the story linger, what keeps it echoing through centuries, is not just the tragedy, but the fairness. The gods of Olympus were capricious. They broke promises, they changed the rules mid-game. Hades, he set one rule, and he kept it. And as for Orpheus, he wandered the earth. Silent, he refused to sing. Some say he eventually met his own tragic end. Others say he was reunited with Eurydice in death, embraced by the very kingdom he once walked through as a guest. We'll never know. But we do know this: Hades kept his word. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Not the loss, not the silence, but the unshakable order beneath it. In the underworld, there are no exceptions. Not even for love, not even for music, not even for gods. Just one promise, one condition, and one final look that cost everything. For a god who ruled over literally every mortal soul that ever lived. Hades didn't get a lot of party invites. Unlike Zeus with his towering altars and Poseidon with seaside shrines, Hades was almost entirely absent from the religious spotlight. There were no grand festivals thrown in his honor, no cheerful hymns sung at sunrise, no temples bustling with daily worship. In fact, for most of ancient Greek history, people went out of their way to avoid saying his name at all. He was respected, yes, deeply, but loved, not so much. So why did the god of the underworld have so little fanfare? Part of it comes down to fear. The Greeks weren't terrified of Hades himself, but of what he represented: death, endings, the great silence that follows every final breath. To invoke him casually was thought to tempt fate. Say his name too freely, and you might draw his attention, or worse, a summons. Instead, people used euphemisms. He was called Plauton, the wealthy one, Ubulus, good counselor, or simply the unseen. His Roman name, Pluto, carries that same root: wealth, not horror. It was a linguistic form of knocking on wood. But it wasn't just about language. In the whole of Greece, there were very few temples dedicated to Hades. The most notable was in Elis, and it only opened once a year. Once, a single day of access, in total silence, and with highly controlled ritual. Compare that to the raucous festivals for Dionysus or the week-long athletic games in honor of Zeus, and you start to get a sense of just how low-key Hades' worship was. People didn't gather in crowds to celebrate him. They whispered, in private, often underground, literally. Some cult practices associated with Hades were chthonic, meaning they took place beneath the earth. Libations were poured into holes in the ground. Animals, usually black, were sacrificed and buried rather than burned. There was no smoke rising to Olympus, no song, just dark wine soaking into dark soil. There's a fascinating theory among scholars that Hades' minimal worship wasn't a snub, but a sign of reverence. In Greek thought, certain powers were so profound, so absolute, that you didn't honor them by celebration, you honored them by restraint, by leaving them alone. Hades wasn't a god you begged for rain or luck. He was a god you acknowledged at the final curtain. And yet, paradoxically, he was always present. Every funeral rite, every grave inscription, every whispered prayer for the dead was a nod to his domain. He may not have had a fan club, but he had a monopoly. There's a lesser-known reference from a fragmentary play by Aeschylus, in which a priest remarks that even in silence, Hades hears. It suggests that the very absence of worship was, in a way, his worship. And still, he played a vital role in mystery religions, like the Eleusinian mysteries, where initiates hoped for a better afterlife. While Demeter and Persephone took center stage, Hades lingered in the background, never named, never praised, but always understood to be the gatekeeper. It's worth noting that even artists didn't depict him much. In vase paintings and sculptures, he appears rarely, usually beside Persephone, often seated, always dignified. No dramatic gestures, no thunderbolts, just a quiet presence in the corner of eternity. Classicists still debate whether Hades' obscurity was by his design or the mortals. Was he a withdrawn god who didn't want the spotlight? Or was humanity simply too unnerved by what he stood for to build him a proper fan base? Maybe both, because Hades didn't demand temples. He didn't stir up myths to attract followers. He didn't crave the cheers or sacrifices. He ruled without applause. He enforced without spectacle, and perhaps that's why he remains one of the most enduring figures in all mythology. Not because people loved him, but because they couldn't ignore him, so no. He didn't have a temple on every street corner, but he had every tombstone, every whispered goodbye, every final breath. Somewhere along the way, Hades, the quiet, dutiful god of the underworld, got himself a makeover. A big one. Flames, horns, glowing eyes, a booming laugh. From Saturday morning cartoons to moody video games, he went from cosmic administrator to full-blown supervillain. But how did that happen? In ancient myth, Hades was not evil. He was feared. Yes, death always is, but he wasn't malicious, chaotic, or cruel. He didn't tempt mortals into ruin or hurl souls into fire. And yet, in pop culture, he's become shorthand for evil god, the villain of Olympus, the boss fight at the end of every underworld level. It's a branding catastrophe, or maybe a PR masterclass, depending on how you look at it. A big turning point came during the Roman era. As Christianity spread, the concept of the underworld shifted from a morally neutral place of rest and judgment to a moral battleground. Heaven above, hell below. With that shift came a tendency to associate underground deities with demonic traits. Hades became Pluto, Pluto became a shadow, and suddenly the god of wealth and death was lumped into the same category as Satan. Fast forward to modern times, and boom, he's wearing red. He's got horns, and he's plotting to overthrow Zeus. In every adaptation ever, take Disney's 1997 Hercules, where Hades is a fast-talking, blue flame-haired trickster who spends the whole movie trying to usurp Olympus. He's charismatic, funny, and absolutely nothing like the original. In fact, Hades was one of the least rebellious Olympians. If anything, he was the most lawful. Or consider the video game God of War, where Hades appears as a monstrous, violent creature surrounded by flame and torment. Again, visually powerful, but mythologically. Off he didn't torment the dead, he organized them. He didn't rage at mortals, he barely noticed them. Classicists still argue about whether this modern portrayal is just harmless creative license or if it distorts a fundamentally misunderstood god. Some say turning Hades into a villain reflects modern discomfort with death. We need a bad guy, and he's convenient. Others think it's a way to inject narrative tension. After all, it's hard to write a quiet, ruler-bidding bureaucrat into a thrilling climax. But there are exceptions. In Hades' Tone, the Tony Award-winning musical, Hades is portrayed with nuanced, a stern, deeply powerful figure who controls industry and loss, but who still loves Persephone. He's not evil, just heavy, inevitable. That portrayal comes closer to the old myths than most. Or the indie game, Hades by Supergiant Games. Here, the god is gruff, serious, but not villainous. He's depicted as a demanding father and a tireless administrator, someone who cares about the rules, even when they chafe. It's one of the rare times Hades is shown not as a monster, but as a manager. And here's a lesser-known media moment. In the 1960s Clash of the Titans, Hades doesn't even show up. The underworld is just there, like a given. That's silence. Weirdly myth-accurate. So why does this matter? Because the way we tell stories shapes how we understand the world and the gods. Hades becoming a villain says more about us than about him. It reflects how we fear death, how we misunderstand silence, how we conflate darkness with malice. And maybe that's the great irony. Hades, the god who never lied, who kept the balance, who enforced the rules everyone else broke, is now cast as the traitor, the one who never sought glory, turned into the villain. He didn't fall like Lucifer. He didn't rage like Ares. He didn't betray like Prometheus. He just stayed in his lane, watched the world from the shadows, and waited. So the next time you see Hades flaming across a screen, plotting something theatrical and villainous, remember, the original Hades didn't need drama. He didn't want power plays or revenge. He already had something far more enduring. Eventually. Now, if there's one thing scholars love more than uncovering ancient pottery shards, it's arguing about the personalities of gods. And Hades, he remains one of the most hotly debated Olympians in the entire pantheon. Was he just? Or was he cold? Was he feared? Or was he respected? Was he a villain, or merely a cosmic functionary doing a thankless job? Ask 10 classicists, and you'll get at least 12 opinions. Some scholars point to the Homeric hymns and early epics as evidence that Hades was originally viewed with austere dignity. He wasn't worshipped like Zeus or Apollo, but he wasn't reviled either. He fulfilled a critical role in the divine ecosystem, the necessary stillness beneath all motion. Without death, there is no life. Without endings, no beginnings. In this light, Hades is balance personified. Others dig into the Orphic texts, those mystical fragments that are obsessed over death, rebirth, and the soul's cosmic journey, and suggest that Hades may have been part of a more spiritual, esoteric framework. In these writings, he's not a jailer but a gatekeeper of transformation, the last figure you meet before your soul re-enters the cycle. Less grim reaper, more soul curator. And then there's the philosophical Hades, the one hinted at by thinkers like Plato. In the Republic, Plato toys with the idea of death as a philosophical concept, unknowable, inevitable, and necessary for virtue. Hades becomes a kind of metaphysical symbol, a ruler not of bodies but of truth, the final judgment, the end that clarifies all. But not everyone buys the stoic, noble image. Some point to later tragic plays where Hades is portrayed as remote, even cruel, a silent power who won't be moved by tears or music. In Euripides, for instance, Hades is an absent force, looming over every scene of loss. The characters know he listens, but they also know he never speaks. It's unsettling, powerful, unyielding. A fragment from Pindar suggests that even heroes couldn't bargain with Hades. Once the line was crossed, no appeal, no offering, no sacrifice could turn back time. And that impenetrability, that emotional distance has fueled centuries of interpretation. So, is he a god of fairness or a figure of cosmic indifference? Even the ancient Greeks couldn't agree. In some regions, he was honored as Plauton, generous and life-giving. In others, he was invoked as Adonis, the invisible, the untouchable. His name appears in curses and blessings alike. His myths are short but loaded with moral ambiguity. There's even a curious scholion, a margin note from a Roman copyist, that asks outright, why do the poets avoid him? The answer, scribbled in a cramped spidery hand, is chilling. Because he is already known. He's the god no one needs reminding of. The name we don't say, because his presence is inevitable. And yet, in modern scholarship, Hades has been undergoing a bit of a reputation glow-up. Newer interpretations emphasize his reliability, his restraint, and his cosmic necessity. Writers are starting to reframe him not as a villain or a recluse, but as a kind of eternal steward, one who never fails, never leaves, and never lets the boundaries of life unravel. One of the more poetic theories argues that Hades is the mirror of all the other gods. Where they act, he waits. Where they rage, he watches. Where they lie, he holds the truth, in stone, and shadow, and silence. So classicists will continue to argue, and that's fine, because perhaps the real power of Hades is that he refuses to be pinned down. He doesn't fit the binary of good or evil, just or cruel. He exists in the grey, the granite grey of ancient tombs, of memory, of endings. And in that grey, he endures. While the rest of Olympus feasts and fights, Hades simply waits. Silent, steady, eternal. So here we are at the end of the road, and fittingly, in the domain of the god who governs endings, Hades has worn many masks across the ages. To some, he's been the lurking shadow at the edge of life. To others, the misunderstood ruler of a realm no one wanted to talk about. But tonight, with the myths spread before us like worn scrolls, we begin to see something else. A god, not of terror, but of structure. Not of cruelty, but of consistency. Not a villain, but a vital, if solemn, presence in the divine machine. Let's take a moment to reflect on what he didn't do. He didn't seduce mortals by the dozen. He didn't meddle in every hero's journey. He didn't rage, scheme, or manipulate. What he did was uphold law. The unbreakable, often thankless, eternal law that says, what lives must die, what dies must rest, and what rests must remain undisturbed. Not villainy. That's maintenance. The ultimate cosmic janitor, uncelebrated, but absolutely essential. And yet, in that silence, in that stillness, there's room for depth. The devotion to Persephone, who returned to him year after year. The careful loan of the helm of darkness to those who needed it most. The willingness to allow Orpheus to try. The grace to let mortals speak, bargain, beg, and the strength to still say no when the law required it. There's a lesser-known passage in a hymn attributed to Orpheus himself, where Hades is praised, not for power, but for peace, for the way he shelters the souls of the lost, for the way he keeps the memory of every life like a flame burning low in an underground hall. He is, perhaps, the most human of the gods, not because he shares our flaws, but because he shares our boundaries, our limits, our need for closure. Classicists will continue to reshape his image. Artists will reinterpret him. Writers will invent new myths. But underneath all of it, Hades will still be sitting on that shadowed throne, watching, waiting, unchanging. He doesn't need temples or fanfare. He doesn't want applause. He simply exists in the place where we all, eventually, arrive. And maybe that's the most comforting thought of all, that when the story ends, there's someone waiting, not with judgment, but with order, not with fire, but with quiet, not to punish, but to remember. So the next time you hear Hades mentioned as the bad guy, smile to yourself. You know better. You've walked his halls, you've met his dog, you've heard his silence, and it wasn't scary, it was inevitable. And now, as the final echoes of this tale drift softly into the quiet of your room, let your breath slow, let your limbs sink deeper into the softness beneath you. You've walked among gods tonight, not in the clash of thunder or the roar of storms, but in the hush of stone corridors, under dim torchlight, beside a throne that never needed to shout to be heard. Hades may have ruled the realm of endings, but he teaches us something about beginnings too, about calm, about patience, about the strength that comes from simply enduring. His world wasn't a place of punishment, but of passage, a destination, a return. So allow your thoughts to settle, like autumn leaves on a still pond. No need to rush, no need to chase the next moment. Let this one stretch, long and soft, through the hush of midnight. Let your mind drift back to Persephone's gentle footsteps on obsidian floors, to the glint of a pomegranate seed in the dark, to the three-headed dog curled at his master's feet. Let Hades hold your thoughts for a while, and when sleep finally comes, as it always does, know that you are resting in a story that spans millennia, one told in whispers, preserved in fragments, but now fully yours. Sweet dreams, traveler, you've earned them.